It began with something as ordinary as moving into a new home. The quiet neighborhood seemed perfect on the surface, lined with freshly cut grass, identical houses, and neighbors who waved politely as I carried boxes inside. But beneath the trimmed hedges and forced smiles lurked an atmosphere that would eventually reveal itself as toxic. This wasn't just a suburb, it was the dominion of a homeowners association, and at the center of its power was a woman who treated the community like her private kingdom. Her name was Karen, and she would soon make it her mission to ruin me. At first, there was no sign of conflict. I had purchased the property as both an investment and a place to settle after years of moving from rental to rental. The house itself was sturdy, modern, and came with a backyard that gave me just enough space to breathe. I imagined peaceful mornings, coffee on the patio, and weekends dedicated to home improvement projects. But like so many stories that start with hopeful beginnings, mine took a sharp turn the moment Karen decided I was an enemy. The first encounter was subtle. A letter appeared in my mailbox, stamped with the HOA logo, warning me that my trash cans had been left visible from the street for longer than the approved time frame. I checked the timestamps of my security camera and realized they had only been out for 30 minutes past collection. Still, I shrugged it off, assuming it was just a procedural reminder. But the letters continued. The grass, they claimed, was 1 inch taller than the HOA-approved limit. My car, they said, had been parked 2 feet closer to the curb than regulations allowed. Even the color of my mailbox was suddenly under scrutiny, despite being the same shade as half the neighborhood. Each letter carried not only a warning, but also the implication of fines, restrictions, and further enforcement. Behind these letters, I began to sense a guiding hand. Neighbors whispered about the president of the HOA, a woman infamous for her relentless control. She didn't just enforce rules, she weaponized them. That woman was Karen, who lived 3 houses down in a meticulously maintained property that looked more like a showroom than a home. Her reputation was legendary. She prowled the streets at night with a flashlight, documenting infractions. She took pictures of lawns, fences, and even seasonal decorations, filing reports as if she were a law enforcement officer. To her, the HOA wasn't a collective agreement. Between homeowners, it was a throne from which she reigned supreme. Soon, her focus shifted from passive letters to direct confrontation. I noticed her standing outside my house, phone in hand, snapping pictures of my driveway. Once, I returned home to find her measuring the width of my flower bed with a tape measure, scribbling notes on a clipboard. Her obsession with my property was undeniable. Then came the escalation. One evening, I heard the sound of tires screeching outside. When I stepped out, 2 police cars were parked at my curb. Officers approached, stating that they had received reports of illegal activity on my property. According to the caller, I was operating some kind of unlicensed business out of my garage. The accusation was absurd. My garage contained nothing more sinister than tools, a lawnmower, and storage boxes. But to the officers, procedure demanded a search. Karen stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, smirking as if she had orchestrated a grand victory. The officers quickly realized the report was baseless, apologized, and left. Yet the damage was done. My neighbors peeked through blinds, whispering about what might have triggered the call. Karen had planted the seed of suspicion, and once planted, such seeds are hard to uproot. This wasn't the end. Over the next few weeks, my mailbox was mysteriously vandalized. My trash bins went missing, and a strange chemical smell lingered in my front yard where grass began to wither unnaturally fast. Every incident pointed to sabotage, but there was never evidence solid enough to accuse anyone. Still, I didn't need evidence. I knew who was behind it. Karen's hostility became a storm, one designed to wear me down, isolate me from the community, and push me into compliance, or better yet, out of the neighborhood entirely. For most people, her tactics worked. She thrived on intimidation, leaving behind a trail of resigned homeowners who bent to her will. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't like most people, because while she thought of me as just another homeowner under her thumb, the truth was something entirely different. The property I had purchased wasn't just my residence. It was part of a larger portfolio I had quietly acquired over the years. Through careful investments, I had accumulated ownership of multiple homes in the area, including the one Karen lived in. She wasn't my ruler. She was my tenant. I had stayed quiet about it, preferring not to flaunt my position. My goal was never to embarrass or humiliate anyone. I wanted peace, not conflict. But Karen had declared war, and with each stunt she pulled, she drew closer to a revelation that would shatter her smug authority. The irony was delicious. Every fine she threatened me with, every false report she filed, every smirk she gave as she tried to sabotage my life, all of it was built on a foundation she didn't realize I controlled. The walls of her empire were nothing more than paper, and I held the match that could set them ablaze. For now, though, I stayed patient. I documented everything. Every letter, every picture, every suspicious act. The more evidence I collected, the stronger my position would be when the time came. And the time was coming soon, because Karen was growing bolder. She wasn't satisfied with harassment from the shadows. She wanted a confrontation that would cement her dominance. And that confrontation was closer than either of us realized. Because the very next week, she would take her campaign to a level that forced me to respond. She would call the cops again, this time with accusations so outrageous they nearly cost me my freedom. But in trying to destroy me, she would only succeed in exposing the truth she feared most, that her landlord wasn't a faceless corporation or some distant investor. Her landlord was me, the neighbor she had been tormenting, and when that moment of revelation came, the look on her face would be worth every second of the misery she tried to inflict. The harassment escalated slowly at first, but soon reached a boiling point. I thought I had seen the worst of Karen's antics when she reported me for false infractions and sabotaged my yard. I had even come to expect her daily patrols past my driveway, her phone angled just so, recording every movement I made as if she were compiling a case file. But nothing could have prepared me for the night she decided to involve the police again, this time with a vengeance that nearly upended my entire life. It was a Friday evening, the kind where most people wound down with a drink, a television show, or the comfort of a quiet household. For me, it had been a long week filled with repairs, tenant management, and paperwork related to the properties I owned. All I wanted was to rest. But peace was never part of Karen's agenda. She had been unusually quiet for a few days, which should have been my first warning. Silence, when it came from her, wasn't a retreat. It was preparation. At around 8 p.m., I heard the sharp rap of knuckles against my door. When I opened it, the flashing lights of 2 police cruisers illuminated my front yard, and uniformed officers stood grim-faced at the threshold. Their voices were steady, but laced with the weight of urgency. A serious accusation had been made against me. According to the report, I was suspected of harboring illegal substances, possibly even distributing them from inside my home. The absurdity of the claim left me speechless for a moment. Me, a landlord and property investor, reduced to the target of fabricated criminal activity by a neighbor with too much free time. But the officers weren't there to debate the credibility of the accusation. They had a warrant, and they intended to search. As I stepped aside, my mind raced. The realization hit me like a stone to the chest. This wasn't just another prank call or petty harassment. This was an attempt to destroy my life, my reputation, and possibly even my freedom. And at the center of it all was Karen, standing smugly at the end of the street, arms folded across her chest, watching the scene unfold like a theater performance she had orchestrated. The officers moved methodically through my home. They checked every room, opened every drawer, and examined every corner. Of course, they found nothing. My life was clean, my record spotless, and my home free of anything remotely illegal, but the search itself was damaging enough. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks, whispering as the police combed through my property. Curious eyes peered from windows, and phones were raised to capture footage. By the time the officers left, satisfied that the accusations were false, the neighborhood had already drawn its own conclusions. Whispers spread quickly in communities like ours. Even after the truth was clear, suspicion lingered. To many, it didn't matter that nothing had been found. The fact that police had shown up at all was enough to taint a reputation. Karen knew this. She thrived on perception, not reality. To her, planting the idea that I was dangerous or untrustworthy was victory enough. That night, I sat in silence, replaying the events in my mind. The rage bubbled under my skin, but alongside it was a clarity I hadn't felt before. Karen wasn't just an annoyance anymore. She was a genuine threat. She had crossed a line, escalating her harassment from petty HOA infractions to full-blown criminal accusations. If I allowed this to continue unchecked, who knew what she would attempt next? So I made a decision. No more passivity. No more silent endurance. I would not let her dictate the terms of my life. From that moment on, I would gather evidence with the precision of a prosecutor. Every letter she sent, every report she filed, every incident she engineered, I would document it all meticulously. If she wanted war, I would not only defend myself, I would prepare to expose her in a way that would strip her of the authority she wielded so recklessly. Over the following days, I set up additional security cameras around my home. High definition, motion-activated, and strategically placed, they captured every movement within range of my property. I kept copies of every HOA letter, filed them in chronological order, and took photographs of the supposed infractions to prove their falsity. I even began reaching out quietly to other neighbors, those who had suffered under Karen's iron rule, and gathered their testimonies. Each story was a piece of the puzzle, painting a picture of a woman who had long abused her position for personal satisfaction. Meanwhile, Karen grew bolder. She strutted through the neighborhood with renewed arrogance, as if the police visit had cemented her authority. I could see it in the way she barked at children riding bicycles too close to her lawn, the way she chastised families for hanging seasonal decorations that didn't match the HOA-approved color scheme, and the way she smirked whenever our eyes met across the street. She believed she had won. But what she didn't know was that the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. With each passing day, her reign was drawing closer to collapse. Because in her relentless obsession with controlling everyone else's lives, she had forgotten the most critical detail of all. She was living in a house she didn't own. A house that belonged to me. The irony was almost poetic. While she strutted around, threatening homeowners with fines and wielding the HOA handbook like a weapon, her own residence was subject to my discretion. Every month she paid rent, unknowingly, funneling money into the pocket of the very person she despised. She saw me as her subordinate, her victim, but in reality she was already under my authority in a way she hadn't yet realized. And soon she would, because the police call had been her greatest mistake. It had forced me to act, to abandon patience, and prepare for revelation. She thought she had frozen me in fear, but in truth, she had set in motion the very events that would unravel her entire facade. The final act was still some distance away, but it was coming. The evidence was piling up. The community was whispering louder, and Karen's arrogance blinded her to the trap closing in around her. For now, I let her enjoy her illusion of power. I let her bask in the false victory she thought she had achieved. But deep down, I knew her reckoning was inevitable. And when it came, it would not be quiet. It would shake the foundation of the neighborhood she ruled and reveal the truth she could never face. That the man she tried to destroy was the one person she couldn't afford to cross. The stage was set. All it needed now was the moment of revelation. By the time the dust settled from the false police report, Karen had convinced herself that she had won. The smug expression on her face whenever we crossed paths was proof enough. She strutted through the neighborhood with her clipboard and camera phone like a self-appointed sheriff, basking in the attention of those too timid to challenge her. But her victory was an illusion, and illusions are fragile. For a time, I allowed her to savor it. I went about my life quietly, tending to my house and managing my properties, while keeping one eye trained on the evidence I was gathering. The security cameras around my home captured every suspicious glance she threw my way, every time she lingered near my property as if waiting for an opportunity to strike. My files grew thick with copies of letters, notices, and records of her harassment. Each document, each video clip, each photograph was a nail in the coffin of her authority. But Karen was never content with a small win. Her obsession with dominance required escalation. Harassment only fed her appetite for more control, and soon enough, she pushed further than she ever had before. It started with my car. One morning, I walked out to find long, deliberate scratches running across the driver's side door. The kind of damage that couldn't have come from an accident or random vandalism. This was personal. I reviewed the security footage, and there she was, Karen herself, in the early hours of the morning, strolling past my driveway with what appeared to be keys in hand, dragging them across the paint as casually as if she were plucking weeds from her garden. The sight of it was infuriating, but it also solidified what I already knew. She was spiraling out of control. She no longer cared about hiding her actions. She believed she was untouchable, immune to consequences because of her position as HOA president. She believed, wrongly, that fear would keep everyone silent. I reported the damage, of course, but I didn't confront her, not yet. Patience was still my ally, and the time for confrontation was still approaching. Instead, I quietly added the footage to my growing collection of evidence. But Karen wasn't finished. A week later, I discovered that my water supply had been tampered with. The valve near the curb, which controlled the flow into my home, had been shut off in the middle of the night. By morning, I had no running water, and my sprinklers had failed to activate. The heat of the sun was already scorching the lawn, leaving patches of grass dry and brittle. Again, the cameras told the story. Karen crouched near the curb in the dead of night, fumbling with the water valve before scurrying away. The audacity was staggering. She was willing to sabotage the basic utilities of her neighbors just to create inconvenience, to fuel her vendetta. It was around this time that other homeowners began to speak up. Quietly, hesitantly, they approached me with their own stories of Karen's abuse. One family recounted how she fined them repeatedly for having their teenage son's car parked in the driveway instead of the garage, even though the garage was full of stored household items. Another neighbor explained how she demanded they remove a perfectly healthy tree because it interfered with the uniform appearance of the street. Yet another described how she once berated their elderly mother for leaving a garden ornament outside, calling it clutter. The stories were endless, each one worse than the last. And as I listened, I realized something important. Karen had spent years building a wall of fear around herself. People hated her, but they tolerated her because they didn't believe they had the power to fight back. They had been conditioned to accept her tyranny, to keep their heads down and avoid her wrath. But what they didn't know was that I was different. I wasn't just another neighbor under her thumb. I wasn't just another homeowner trapped in the web of HOA fines and threats. I was the one person who had the means and the leverage to bring her down. Still, Karen wasn't aware of this truth, and her arrogance only grew. She began parading her hostility more openly, complaining to anyone who would listen about the troublemaker who had moved into the community. She accused me of breaking rules that didn't even exist, inventing regulations on the spot just to justify her harassment. She even began suggesting, in whispers to others, that I should be removed from the neighborhood entirely. The tipping point came on a Saturday afternoon. I had just finished mowing my lawn when I noticed a crowd gathering near the HOA office, a small, converted building at the edge of the community where meetings were held. Karen stood at the center, waving papers in her hand, her voice carrying across the cul-de-sac. She had called an emergency HOA meeting, and the subject of that meeting was me. I stayed back at first, watching from a distance. Her voice was shrill, filled with the satisfaction of someone who believed she held absolute power. She accused me of being a disruptive influence, of repeatedly violating community guidelines, of endangering the peace and harmony of the neighborhood. She held up fabricated reports, pointing to supposed violations that I had supposedly committed. The neighbors listened, some nodding nervously, others frowning in doubt. But I could see the cracks in her influence. People were growing tired of her antics. They didn't cheer her on with the enthusiasm she expected. They shifted uncomfortably, whispered among themselves, and avoided her gaze. That was when I decided enough was enough. I stepped forward, my presence drawing silence from the crowd. Karen's eyes lit up with the thrill of confrontation, certain that she had cornered me. She launched into another tirade, waving her papers like weapons, insisting that I was a menace to the community, but I didn't respond, not yet. I let her rant, let her spew her accusations in front of everyone, knowing full well that the moment of truth was approaching. The time for patience was over. The trap had been set, and Karen had walked straight into it. What she didn't realize was that this public spectacle she had created would be the very stage where her empire crumbled. Because when I finally revealed who I truly was, not just her neighbor, not just her target, but her landlord, the mask she wore would shatter. The meeting ended with Karen declaring that action would soon be taken against me. She left with her head high, convinced she had cemented her dominance once again. But in reality, all she had done was set the stage for her own downfall. And as the crowd dispersed, as whispers spread and doubt grew louder, I knew the moment was drawing close. Karen had pushed too far, and soon she would learn the one truth that would strip her of everything she thought she controlled. The so-called emergency meeting lingered in everyone's minds long after Karen dispersed the crowd with her grand pronouncements. She had spoken as if she were delivering a royal decree, certain that her neighbors would fall in line and rally against me. But something subtle had shifted in that gathering. The silence, the sideways glances, the murmurs, those were not signs of obedience. They were signs of doubt. Karen didn't see it. She was blinded by her own arrogance. For her, the community was a stage and she was the star. But stars burn out when the fuel runs dry, and Karen had been burning her neighbors for far too long. What she didn't know was that she had already set the final act in motion, and this time she wasn't in control. I had decided that the next HOA meeting, the official monthly gathering, would be the stage for the truth. For weeks, I gathered everything I needed: the security footage of her vandalizing my car and tampering with my water, the false letters she had sent, the testimonies from neighbors she had bullied. I organized it all into a clear, undeniable presentation. But the evidence alone wasn't enough. The real blow would come from the one fact she had ignored, the one piece of reality that her arrogance had blinded her to. She was living in a house she didn't own. The day of the meeting arrived. The small HOA office was packed tighter than usual. Word had spread quickly after her emergency meeting, and curiosity drew nearly every homeowner in the neighborhood. Karen sat at the head of the table, dressed sharply as if preparing for battle, her stack of paperwork placed like weapons in front of her. She looked across the room, her gaze landing on me with the satisfaction of someone convinced that victory was already secured. The meeting began in predictable fashion. Karen launched into her agenda, wasting no time before dragging my name through. The mud once again. She spoke of repeated violations, of my supposed disregard for community rules, of the dangerous precedent I represented if allowed to remain unchecked. Her words were sharp, her tone condescending, and her performance rehearsed. Neighbors shifted uneasily in their seats. Some looked at me with sympathy, others with curiosity, but very few seemed willing to voice support for Karen. Still, she pressed on, oblivious to the crumbling foundation beneath her. She was so certain of her power that she didn't notice when I slowly stood, a folder of documents in my hand, and moved toward the front of the room. The moment I placed the folder on the table, the room fell silent. Karen paused, her mouth half open mid-accusation. She leaned back slightly, clearly unprepared for me to challenge her so directly. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Instead, I began to present the facts. One by one, I laid out the evidence. The photos of my scratched car, paired with the security footage of her walking past it in the dead of night, keys dragging along the paint. The video of her crouching by my water valve, shutting it off under cover of darkness. The letters she had written, each accompanied by proof that the alleged violations were fabricated or exaggerated. The testimonies from neighbors detailing her years of harassment and abuse of power. The room grew colder with every page I turned, every clip I showed. Whispers spread like ripples on water, and the faces of the homeowners shifted from doubt to outrage. They had suspected her cruelty, endured it in silence, but seeing it laid bare in undeniable detail was something else entirely. Karen's composure faltered. She interrupted, tried to shout me down, but her protests rang hollow. The evidence was irrefutable, her actions plain for everyone to see. Her confidence crumbled into anger and then into desperation. But the final blow had yet to land. I reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a single document. The property deed. I placed it on the table with deliberate care, sliding it across for everyone to see. Then, with the calmness of someone who had waited long enough, I revealed the truth. The house she lived in, the home she flaunted as a symbol of her superiority, wasn't hers. It was mine. She was my tenant. Her rent checks funneled directly to me every month. The authority she claimed to wield over me was an illusion. In reality, she was living under my roof. Literally. The silence that followed was deafening. Karen froze, her face pale, her mouth opening and closing without sound. For the first time since I had moved into the neighborhood, she had no words, no accusations, no smug retorts. Her carefully constructed identity as queen of the community had been ripped away in an instant. The neighbors erupted. Some laughed openly, unable to contain their disbelief. Others whispered furiously, exchanging stories and realizing the depth of the hypocrisy they had endured. The atmosphere shifted completely. Karen wasn't the enforcer anymore. She was the punchline of her own arrogance. Her power collapsed in real time. The homeowners she had ruled through fear now looked at her with contempt, even pity. The HOA board, previously cowed into silence, could no longer ignore the evidence. They turned on her, demanding explanations, questioning her authority, even suggesting her removal. Karen sat frozen, her hands trembling, her eyes darting from the deed to the faces of the neighbors who had once cowered before her. She had built her kingdom on intimidation, but it had crumbled with the revelation of a single truth. She wasn't the ruler of this neighborhood. She was just another tenant, one who had bitten the hand that fed her. For me, the moment was bittersweet. The months of harassment, the false reports, the vandalism, the humiliation, all of it had led to this. And while I hadn't wanted a confrontation, I couldn't deny the satisfaction of watching her facade shatter. She had wanted a war. But wars are won by those who understand the battlefield. She had never realized that the battlefield she claimed, as her own was mine, all along. The meeting ended in chaos. Karen fled before it was officially adjourned, her once proud stride reduced to hurried, stumbling steps. The neighbors lingered, buzzing with disbelief and relief, some even approaching me to offer thanks or apologies for staying silent so long. The tide had turned, and the fear that once sustained her had been replaced by a new sense of empowerment among the community. But as I left the meeting that night, I knew the story wasn't over. People like Karen don't surrender gracefully. Her authority was gone, her mask ripped away. But her pride, her ego, wouldn't allow her to walk away quietly. She had been exposed, humiliated, and dethroned. And for someone like her, that wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of desperation. The war wasn't finished. It was simply entering a new phase. After the revelation at the HOA meeting, the neighborhood had changed. Conversations that had once been hushed whispers became open discussions. Neighbors who had endured Karen's tyranny for years felt emboldened for the first time. And yet, Karen herself did not disappear quietly into obscurity. Her pride, her obsession with control, demanded one final confrontation. The following week, subtle signs of her defiance appeared almost immediately. Flyers began circulating, accusing me of exaggerating the harassment, of overreacting to minor incidents, and of attempting to manipulate the HOA for personal gain. Anonymous notes were slipped under doors, carefully worded to cast doubt while avoiding direct libel. Even her social media posts, previously innocuous, were now thinly veiled attacks aimed at discrediting me. But by now, the community had seen the evidence firsthand. Her words carried little weight. The damage she had tried to inflict on me in the past, false police reports, property sabotage, and constant intimidation, had been cataloged in meticulous detail. Every move she made now was a risk, and every risk left her more vulnerable. Then came her last desperate attempt. It was a Wednesday morning when I arrived at my property to find the front gate mysteriously chained shut. My security cameras had captured the scene. Karen herself, working quickly and silently in the early hours, placing a heavy chain and padlock across the entrance. Her plan was audacious. She hoped to block me from accessing my own home, asserting a false claim that I had violated community regulations by entering the property improperly. When I confronted her, she froze, not with fear, but with a frantic mix of defiance and realization. She had thought that every move she made was hidden, every action undetected. She hadn't considered that I was prepared, that cameras and witnesses had already recorded her every step. I calmly removed the chain, documenting the entire process on video. The footage alone would be more evidence for the HOA board and any legal proceedings. She tried to argue, to assert authority, but the look on her face betrayed panic. For the first time, she understood that the balance of power had shifted entirely. The HOA board convened again, this time under enormous scrutiny. Neighbors attended not out of obligation, but out of curiosity, eager to see how the woman who had tormented them for years would respond to accountability. Karen arrived, her usual air of superiority replaced by tension and unease. She tried to plead her case, citing trivial rules, misinterpreted guidelines, and exaggerated concerns about my behavior. But the board and the community had seen enough. One by one, neighbors shared their experiences. They recounted years of intimidation, fines, harassment, and sabotage, all directly linked to Karen. Her credibility unraveled with each testimony. The evidence I presented, security footage, documented letters, and sworn statements, left no room for doubt. The neighborhood realized that she had not been protecting them, enforcing rules, or preserving property values. She had been exploiting fear, manipulating perception, and attempting to control lives for personal satisfaction. Karen's desperation peaked when the discussion turned to the legality of her residency. The deed had already been made public in the previous HOA meeting, And the board now confronted her about her oblivious status as a tenant in my property. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had acted as a ruler over her subjects for years, completely unaware that she had no real authority over anyone. Not over me, not over the neighborhood, not over the HOA. By mid-afternoon, it was clear that her reign was over. The HOA voted to strip her of her title and authority immediately. Karen had lost every ounce of power she had clung to so desperately. She was no longer president, no longer enforcer, and no longer capable of intimidating neighbors. Humiliation settled in like a storm. Karen left the room in silence, her expression vacant and defeated. The neighbors watched, some with satisfaction, some with disbelief at the extremes she had gone to maintain control. The balance of power had shifted completely, and the community began the slow process of rebuilding trust, camaraderie, and fairness. For me, the resolution was bittersweet. The months of harassment, threats, and sabotage had taken their toll, but justice had been served. I had endured the campaign of intimidation without retaliating impulsively, documenting every action carefully and allowing the truth to reveal itself. Karen's fall was not just vindication. It was proof that patience, preparation, and persistence can dismantle even the most arrogant tyrants. The neighborhood transformed in the weeks following her removal. Conversations were no longer conducted in fear. Rules were enforced fairly, not selectively. Homeowners began to take pride in their properties, celebrating individuality rather than adhering to a dictator's arbitrary standards. The air was lighter, the streets quieter, and the tension that had once lingered like a cloud had lifted entirely. Karen herself receded into the background, attempting to maintain appearances while quietly contending with her loss. Her attempts to regain influence failed completely. The residents she had terrorized had witnessed too much, and no one was willing to tolerate her dominance again. She was, for the first time, powerless in the very community she had sought to control. In the end, the story of her downfall became a cautionary tale, a legend whispered among neighbors about the dangers of arrogance, obsession, and tyranny in a supposedly peaceful suburb. It was proof that even those who believe themselves untouchable are vulnerable to the consequences of their own actions, and that patience and strategy can overcome even the most relentless adversaries. And as for me, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. I continued to manage my properties, maintain my home, and interact with the community with fairness and respect. The chaos Karen had brought into my life became a story, a reminder of vigilance, resilience, and the power of holding one's ground. Karen had called the cops, sabotaged my life, and tried to assert dominance over me. She had created conflict, tension, and fear. But in the end, she had frozen, not in power but in disbelief and defeat, when she realized the one truth she could never escape. I was her landlord. The neighborhood moved forward, stronger and wiser, and I had the satisfaction of knowing that the tyranny of Karen had been ended, not through aggression, but through patience, strategy, and undeniable truth. The streets were peaceful, the homeowners were empowered, and the chapter of her reign of intimidation was closed forever. And somewhere, in the corner of the community she had once ruled, Karen finally understood what it meant to be powerless.